You are standing on the walls of Tianjin in the summer heat of 1864, and the air tastes like grit and burned powder. The city beneath your feet is not a city anymore. It is a stomach that can't digest, a throat that can't swallow, a body that has begun to eat itself. Somewhere beyond the battlements, Qing guns keep time. Dull, metallic impacts that make the stone tremble and the teeth buzz. Each strike is a reminder that faith does not stop shells, and slogans do not grow rice. In the alleys, the markets have been stripped down to empty tables and bitter arguments. A mother watches her child's ribs move like bellows. A soldier runs his finger along the edge of a blade that he may not have the strength to lift tomorrow. The regime still calls this place the heavenly capital, still insists heaven has chosen them, still demands obedience to a vision that once promised a moral world made new. But the walls are closing, the tunnels are groaning under the earth, and the city's mandate, divine or political, has reached the point where it must prove itself with the one thing ideology can never print into existence: food. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. Here's the thing you have to understand right away. The Taiping Rebellion is not a single battle, and it isn't a clean morality play about rebels versus an empire. It is a civil war so vast, so systemic, that its dead are counted not only in bodies, but in empty villages, in vanished harvests, in the silence of abandoned roads. People often repeat one number, 20 million, 30 million, like it's a trophy of horror. But those numbers, as staggering as they are really a shorthand for something more frightening: a society collapsing under the combined weight of belief, violence, bureaucracy, and hunger. The Taiping did not merely fight the Qing. They attempted to replace the Qing, build a rival state with rival laws, rival rituals, rival calendars, rival legitimacy. And the Qing, already battered, survived not by being strong in the way empires like to imagine themselves, one central iron-fisted machine, but by becoming something else: a patchwork of provincial power, regional armies, local gentry, and commanders whose loyalty was purchased with autonomy. Victory, in other words, came with a poison seed inside it. So let's rewind, not to a grand council in Beijing or a throne room dripping with gold, but to a man sitting in humiliation, staring at failure until it mutates into revelation. Hong Xiuquan is not born a conqueror. He is born into a world where status has a gate, and that gate is the civil service examinations. Pass, and you become part of the ruling class, a scholar official with influence, income, dignity. Fail, and you are simply another educated man, with no place, drifting on the edge of a system that promises merit but delivers scarcity. Hong fails. He fails again and again. Each failure is not only personal, it is cosmic in its implication, because the exams are tied to an entire worldview. That order is maintained through learning and hierarchy, that the state is legitimate because it produces officials through ritualized merit. Then something breaks. After one of his attempts, Hong suffers an illness and a mental crisis, and later he frames it as a vision, a journey into a celestial realm, a meeting with a majestic father figure, an encounter with a stern elder brother, a calling to cleanse the world of demons. Now, historians debate details: timing, the sequence of influences, the exact shape of his early beliefs, because human memory is not a stable archive, and political movements rewrite their own origins. But the core is hard to ignore. Hong comes into contact with Christian-influenced texts circulating in southern China, part of the tract tradition associated with evangelical writings like those connected to Liang Fa. These pamphlets are not supposed to start a revolution. They are supposed to convert souls, one by one, in a world where foreign missionaries have limited reach. Paper is a weapon when a society is already bleeding. Hong reads, he interprets. And in a mind already primed by humiliation and visionary experience, the language of God and demons fuses with the politics of corruption and resentment. This is where it gets terrifying, because what Hong does next is a pattern you can find again and again across history. He turns personal failure into cosmic destiny. If the system rejects him, then the system must be rotten. If he cannot enter the ruling class, then heaven must be building a different ladder. And if heaven has chosen him, then every obstacle is not evidence of delusion, it is proof of the world's demonic resistance. But movements don't become mass movements because one man has a vision. They become mass movements because someone else builds the scaffolding. That someone is Feng Yunshan. If Hong is the prophet, Feng is the organizer, the one who understands that belief is only power if you can structure it into cells, recruitment networks, rules, discipline, and a sense of belonging that can survive the death of a leader or the collapse of a town. Feng helps transform Hong's theology into a community, and that community begins to define itself against enemies, not simply political enemies, but metaphysical enemies. Demons, corruption, idolatry, the old order. Imagine what that does to the psychology of a recruit. You are not just a peasant with a spear. You are not just a man hungry for land or dignity. You are a soldier in a cosmic war, and the people you are about to kill are not merely soldiers of the Qing, they are agents of evil. That kind of certainty is a drug. It makes fear feel like temptation. It makes cruelty feel like cleansing. It makes compromise feel like betrayal of heaven itself. The Qing, at first, does what states often do when faced with unrest. It misreads the scale. Local officials try suppression as if this is another rural disturbance, another bandit wave, another localized rebellion that can be smothered with arrests and a few punitive expeditions. But the Taiping are not just a mob. They are an army in formation. They can march and they can hold ground, and crucially, they can govern, however harshly, because they have a narrative that explains why they deserve to rule. And the geography of southern and central China makes this kind of war both easier and deadlier. Rivers are not just scenery here, they are highways. Control the waterways, and you control movement, supply, surprise. The Yangtze Corridor is an artery. The Taiping learn to use it, and the rebellion grows from a regional blaze into a firestorm. By the early 1850s, the movement consolidates and militarizes. And then comes 1853, the moment that turns this from rebellion to existential threat, the seizure of Nanjing. Think about what that means. Nanjing is not a remote village. It is one of the great cities of China, strategically placed, symbolically potent, sitting on a key corridor. When the Taiping take it and rename it Tianjin, heavenly capital, they are not just capturing a prize. They are declaring an alternate China, a rival state with a rival heaven above it. Now the war changes in shape. It becomes a contest between two governments claiming legitimacy over the same civilization. And when that happens, civilians stop being collateral damage and become the central terrain. Because governing means taxes, it means grain, it means conscription, it means labor, it means bureaucracy, it means punishment. Inside Tianjin, the Taiping attempts something radical, a moral revolution. Their proclamations promise a purified world. Their policies aim to remake society. But here's what always happens when utopian visions collide with wartime reality. Coercion fills the gap between what people freely believe and what the regime demands they must do. Rules multiply, surveillance thickens, rituals harden into obedience tests, and the city becomes not only a capital, but a pressure cooker, where devotion is measured by how completely you can surrender private life to public ideology. This is also where we meet the men who embody the movement's darker logic. Yang Shuqing rises as a political powerhouse associated with a kind of divine voice authority within the Taiping leadership. If Hong is the heavenly claimant, Yang becomes a terrifying instrument of heavenly enforcement, feared, powerful, and deeply entangled in the internal politics of a regime that cannot tolerate dissent because dissent is framed as rebellion against God. You might think the greatest danger to the Taiping is the Qing army outside the walls. But the most fatal threat is the one inside their own court, the rivalry, paranoia, and purges that rip apart revolutionary movements once they taste power. This culminates in the violent convulsions often associated with the Tianjin incident of 1856, when internal struggle turns into bloodshed and purges. The exact dynamics and culpabilities are complex and debated, but the outcome is brutally clear. Cohesion is shattered, capable leadership is destroyed, and fear becomes an operating principle. The Taiping do not just fight the Qing, they consume themselves. While the Taiping fracture, the Qing adapt. And this adaptation is not glamorous. It is not heroic cavalry charges or romantic last stands. It is administration and logistics, boring, relentless, lethal. Scholar officials like Zhang Gufan become war organizers, building regional forces that answer to them personally as much as to the dynasty. This is not the central state's proud strength. It is improvisation under existential pressure. Zhang's logic is cold and practical. If the empire's standard forces are unreliable, then build new ones, train them, feed them, bind them through local ties and personal loyalty. Wage war not only with swords and muskets, but with granaries, tax systems, transport networks, and the grim art of siegecraft. In civil wars, you don't always win by being braver. You win by being more sustainable. And the war becomes a grinding contest of cities, fortified lines, and supply routes, where the decisive weapon is often starvation. Armies burn crops, civilians flee, disease spreads through refugee columns, fields go unplanted, markets collapse. This is how death scales into the tens of millions, not through a single massacre, but through the systematic destruction of the systems that keep people alive. Foreign observers drift at the edges of this catastrophe. Some are intrigued by Christian language coming out of the Taiping court, but they also recognize divergence, volatility, and the obvious problem. This is not a tidy missionary conversion story. It is a revolutionary theocracy demanding submission. Foreign priorities often tilt towards stability and trade. In a war like this, ideological sympathy matters less than predictable ports and secure routes. By the early 1860s, the arc bends toward Tianjin. Qing regional forces tighten their grip. The Taiping, weakened internally, struggle to maintain strategic initiative. And that brings us back to 1864, back to those walls you're standing on, back to the heavenly capital becoming a sealed container of human desperation. A siege is not just an assault. A siege is a slow argument between walls and hunger. It is the reduction of a society to its inventory. How much grain, how much clean water, how many bodies can be fed, how long discipline can hold when bellies are empty, and hope becomes an insult. The encirclement tightens. Lifelines are cut. The river routes that once served as highways now serve as barriers and choke points. Outside, Qing's siege lines become a world of trenches, batteries, supply wagons, and the steady bureaucracy of killing. Inside, the city's internal economy collapses into barter, theft, and silent bargaining. People begin to measure time not in days, but in meals. This is where the irony becomes unbearable. The Taiping had promised a new moral order, a purified life. But under siege, morality becomes a luxury. A father stares at a sack of grain like it is a god. Mother calculates how much weakness a child can survive. Soldiers, men trained to believe they are instruments of heaven, begin to desert not because their faith vanishes, but because the body is a tyrant. You can swear allegiance to paradise all day. Your muscles still demand calories. Qing siegecraft does what siegecraft has always done across history. It turns engineering into destiny. Bombardments batter walls and nerves alike. Tunneling and mining operations, reported in many narratives of the siege, transform the ground itself into a threat. Imagine hearing that, the faint tremor under your feet, the sense that the earth has become an enemy. There is no safe place in a city being methodically taken apart. The air fills with smoke and powdered brick. The rhythm of impact becomes a kind of music that nobody can stop hearing, even in sleep. Inside Tianjin, proclamations grow more absolute as reality deteriorates. That is another pattern worth staring at. When a regime is failing, it often intensifies its language rather than moderating it. The leadership doubles down on certainty. To admit weakness would be to admit heaven might be wrong. And if heaven can be wrong, then the entire structure collapses, not just politically, but spiritually. Then comes the most symbolic fracture of all. Hong Xiuqun dies before the final fall of the city. The core fact is solid. He does not live to see Tianjin taken. But the exact circumstances, illness, starvation, possible poisoning, conflicting reports, are debated and clouded by propaganda and chaos. In a sense, the uncertainty fits the moment. A man who claimed cosmic certainty ends in earthly ambiguity while his kingdom starves around him. Now ask yourself, what happens to an apocalyptic movement when its prophet is gone and the walls are breaking? Some cling harder, some lose all restraint, some simply try to survive shedding ideology like a burning robe. Leadership falls to others, figures trying to hold together a collapsing state with slogans, rituals, and increasingly desperate orders. Then the breach comes. A siege does not end with a polite transfer of power, it ends with a rupture, a flood of violence. The Qing storming of Tianjin becomes not just a military operation, but a settling of accounts, a punishment, a warning to the rest of the country. In urban combat, every street becomes a choke point, every doorway a potential execution site, every courtyard a trap. The defenders are exhausted, half starved, many sick. The attackers, hardened by years of civil war, are operating within a logic that often treats the captured city as both prize and plague, something to be cleansed. This is where language fails. Mass killings, execution, slaughter. These words are accurate, but they flatten the experience. Imagine bodies stacked in alleys because there is no time to bury. Imagine families torn apart not by ideology, but by the simple fact of panic. Imagine the sound of doors being broken, not in a single cinematic moment, but over and over, for hours, for days. This is what the fall of capitals looks like when the war is existential. And then comes the aftermath, the part that history sometimes rushes past because it is harder to dramatize than a breach. Tianjin's fall is not just the end of a city, it is the collapse of a rival state that had reorganized lives, enforced rituals, and mobilized millions. The immediate consequences ripple outward. Executions, displacement, reprisals, the grim sorting of survivors into suspects and subjects. The Taiping cause is broken as a coherent threat, but the land is not healed. It is scarred. The death toll of the Taiping era is commonly described in scholarly discussion as reaching into the tens of millions. But the uncertainty matters. Records are fragmentary. War drives migration. Entire districts depopulate and then refill with different people. Death comes not only by blade and bullet, but by famine and disease, by exposure on the road, by the collapse of sanitation and the disruption of planting cycles. The rebellion is less like a single wound and more like an infection spreading through multiple systems at once: economic, demographic, political, and the Qing victory is its own paradox. To survive, the dynasty increasingly relies on regional armies and provincial commanders. Men like Zheng Guofan and later figures like Li Hongshang rise within this logic, capable, pragmatic, powerful. They represent the late dynasty's adaptation, but also its future weakness, because every time the center gives authority to the provinces to solve a crisis, it teaches the provinces that they can act independently. You can save the state by decentralizing it, but you may also be teaching it how to fracture later. This is one of the darkest lessons of civil war. The end of fighting does not mean the end of consequences. The Taiping Rebellion reshapes China's 19th century not only through death and destruction, but through altered power relationships. It accelerates militarization at the provincial level. It exhausts the economy, it leaves communities traumatized, it deepens cynicism about ideology, even as new ideologies will later arrive and promise salvation again. And what about Hong Xiuquan himself, the man at the center of this storm? It is tempting to caricature him as simply mad or simply evil, but that's too easy, and it lets the rest of us off the hook. Hong is a product of a system that promised advancement but delivered humiliation to countless men. He is a mind that encountered foreign religious language at a moment of personal crisis and translated it into a revolutionary cosmology. He is also a leader whose certainty, once weaponized and institutionalized, helped unleash a machinery of coercion and violence that could not be controlled by one man, not even a man convinced he was chosen by heaven. The terrifying truth is that mass death does not require one monster. It requires a chain: social stress, political weakness, a compelling story, organizational talent, militarization, and then the slow grinding logic of war, especially siege war, where starving a city becomes strategy and burning a field. Once that chain is forged, individuals become both perpetrators and victims inside a system that rewards cruelty and punishes hesitation. So, when you picture Tianjin in 1864, don't just picture a fallen capital. Picture the collision of two kinds of power. On one side, belief, absolute, intoxicating, mobilizing. On the other, logistics, granaries, rivers, supply lines, artillery, trenches, and time. Belief can make men march through fire, but logistics decides whether they eat tonight. Belief can justify the unimaginable, but logistics determines how long a society can sustain it. And here's the final image I want you to hold: a city that called itself heaven, ending not in some mystical rapture, but in dust, hunger, and smoke, its fate sealed by the oldest truth of warfare. Not glory, not destiny, the math of supplies, the physics of walls, the human body's refusal to live on words alone. If you want more documentaries that dig into the hidden mechanics of history, the uncomfortable truths beneath the myths, make sure you're subscribed. And I want to ask you something. When you think about the typing rebellion, what feels more frightening to you? The power of absolute belief, or the way ordinary systems like food and administration can decide the fate of millions? Comment your answer and tell me where you're listening from.